Hello, I'm Pete Mercurio and I'm presenting a brief analysis of the book Dougy, written by James Maloney. Dougy is the first book in the Gracie trilogy series, suitable for Year 7s through to Year 10. My choice of Dougy was centred on my own experiences while working at Scotch College as a football coach and observing the Indigenous students on scholarship for their sporting talent. My observations led me down a path that was both critical and in praise of Scotch College's Indigenous scholarship program. Critical in the sense that the program could be perceived as virtue signalling on account of how few Indigenous students have gone through the program, all of which given sporting scholarships, and in praise because so few schools, to my knowledge, have a program like this in place. I've always wanted to teach Aboriginal content and perspectives due to being referred to in extremely racist terms while growing up playing football, such as Abo and Boong. These terms are rooted in the Western Indigenous dynamic, and as someone who had talent on the football field as a junior, I felt that I could somehow relate, or at the very least empathise with these Indigenous students. Being referred to in those terms on the football field was usually done in a positive way, but naturally it's a disgusting turn of phrase and name. But weirdly, also made me feel proud to think that I was Aboriginal because Indigenous players were the best, in my perspective. As a pre-service teacher, I can reflect on these past experiences, educate myself further on Indigenous perspective, and ideally learn how to teach through Aboriginal learning. Duncan Porter and Kirby's article explains the 8-way pedagogy for Aboriginal learning, which perfectly illustrates how to embrace Indigenous perspectives and how to connect them to what is subject of content. I'm determined to integrate Aboriginal perspectives into my pedagogy in content and in process whenever my next placement can proceed. Although I am unlikely to have Indigenous students in my class, it is likely students will be connected to the Indigenous students of the school, particularly in a sporting context. Therefore, I wanted to choose a text that strongly introduced Indigenous perspectives underpinned by scholarship and sport for contextual relatability. When I came across the Gracie Trilogy series, I chose Dougy because I had studied the text in high school, but through this paper I can now perceive it in a different light. Dougy touches on many themes of the Western Indigenous dynamic, and these themes can be critically analysed from Year 7 through to 10, depending on which themes and contexts are chosen. For example, relationships are central to the novel, particularly between Dougy, Gracie and Raymond, all siblings, as well as the closeness and support within the Indigenous community and the overarching mistrust between the Western and Indigenous communities, of which takes place in schools. The lack of knowledge and interest that Dougy and Gracie both have in their Aboriginality in a contemporary context and how that relates to the historic white re-education of the Indigenous communities, and then now the reintegration in a private school setting was very appealing. The connection to the land and stories through the legend of the Mudagudda and how Dougy perceives this legend to be playing out, affecting within the community. And lastly, Gracie receiving that sporting scholarship to a private school that leads to the resentment of the white community, but also builds that idea that Gracie feels burdened by success and being successful in that scholarship. These strong themes that the book utilises, such as race, intercultural dialogue, relevant cultural status relationships and perspectives on colonisation and its impacts years later, allows for students to think deeply and critically of individual backgrounds, how their own background is shaped, and potentially develop empathy and understanding of displaced students aiming to do their family proud. Students can make deep personal connections with this book as it shows us that scholarship is a burden and a blessing. Racism can and does exist consciously or unconsciously, and that family, no matter where you come from, is of the highest importance. Everyone shares some commonalities, family being one, and through our shared experiences, we can develop intercultural empathy and compassion.